We're hoping that this is going to be a really interesting and informal conversation. And Dan has just joined us virtually. Hi, Dan. We're sorry that you're not feeling well, but really pleased that you are able to join us nevertheless. So we're all here today as friends of the region. And clearly, it's a really fluid situation in the South Caucasus, where you have Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine, which has opened up all sorts of issues, regional dynamics, global dynamics, including our very own domestic political situation here. It's all being felt in the South Caucasus, including what's happening dynamically within each country as well. So some have referred to this area of the world as an arc of instability. I choose to look at it as an arc of opportunity, and I think that's something we probably both share, Yuri and Dan. So I think we're going to try to dig into this and find out what the opportunities are for the region, as well as what the U.S. is doing and what the U.S. should be doing about it. But first, I just want to introduce our two panelists. First, of course, Dan, who is the number two here at Carnegie. And he was our ambassador to the OSCE for 4 years. Before that, he was a PDAS and DRL, which is how I first knew him. And importantly, he is the author of a relatively new book called Four Tests, How to Make America Stronger. He's promised me there are not going to be any tests at the end of this, but I do recommend the book to you because it's an important book. And our very special guest is our former colleague, Yuri Kim, who is the PDAS in the European Bureau, responsible for the South Caucasus. And she has served all over the world as a career diplomat, including in this area, importantly in Turkey, which is where we first met. And so welcome, Yuri. And I think Yuri would like to make a few comments up front, sort of framing our discussion.
Well, first of all, it's really wonderful to see a packed room to discuss the South Caucasus. Let me just start off by saying something that Masha mentioned. For too long, the South Caucasus has been seen as a hotbed of conflict, instability, atrocity, bloodshed, hopelessness. And for the first time in a long time, we're now looking at a situation in which we have an opportunity for a durable and dignified peace between two of the countries that have been at war formally for 30 years, at odds with each other for centuries more. We have an opportunity to transform the region from a place of instability into a major corridor for energy and the transport of goods and ideas from Asia out to Europe, turning the South Caucasus into a gateway between two very important regions. Most importantly, for many of us, we see this as an opportunity to transform the future of each of the three countries in the South Caucasus, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Georgia. Some of these stories are a little bit happier than others at this particular junction, but for the United States, we see opportunity in all of those countries. For Armenia, we see a huge historic opportunity to break that country out of its isolation. It's been isolated for too long, dependent on one country, very unkind neighbor, frankly, for too long. There's now an opportunity to develop ties, to diversify Armenia's relationships so that they have more choices. We believe very strongly as the United States, as you know, that peoples and countries have the right to determine their own future. Very important. We also look at our relationship with Azerbaijan, complicated. It's complicated. But we see an opportunity to work with Aliyev and the Azeri people to see how we can use their energy assets to bring greater stability, diversity, independence to a broader swath of the world. Finally, with Georgia, they are faced with a very difficult choice at this time. Choice is the wrong word. It's a dilemma. The choices are clear in the sense that 90% of the Georgian people have said that they want their future to be inside the European Union. So there's no doubt about that. But the people of Georgia have a government that's not necessarily listening to them. So, tricky situation. I could go on, but let me leave it here, and I'm looking forward to having more of a conversation with the folks in this room. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Yuri. So I should have said this up front. I will ask our two panelists a number of questions up front, and then we'll open it up to audience questions. And so I think there's an ability to put in questions through a QR code. And we hope that you are going to ask lots of questions, because this is, I think, a great opportunity for a lot more information. Yuri, if I could just ask you, because I think that I mean, you've painted a very positive picture of the opportunities, but I think, you know, the key is peace. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what the latest is on the discussions between Armenia and Azerbaijan, to the extent that you can share with us, and what the U.S. is doing and other parties.
So, you know, they've come a very long way. So for years and years, the United States, along with several other countries, as well as the OSCE, and Dan knows a lot about this because he was right in the thick of it. The OSCE, which is the Organization for Security and Security and Cooperation in Europe. Okay, got it. I used to be the head of the office, so it's shame on me. But for years, we have been working to get the Armenians and the Azerbaijanis to, first of all, talk to each other like equals, and try to address some of the very difficult issues that have transpired between them. The reality is, as everybody here knows, there was a huge conflict over the status of Nagorno-Karabakh, which the United States, like the rest of the international community, has recognized as a part of Azerbaijan. It's also true that there were more than 100,000 Armenians who lived in Nagorno-Karabakh. And in September of last year, 19th to 20th, the Azeri government conducted a lightning military strike that led to, now, whether the Azeri government intended it or not, the result was that over 100,000 Armenians, almost all the ethnic Armenians living in Nagorno-Karabakh, departed. And they cited leaving because of fear. So they're now in Armenia. The United States has responded by providing tremendous humanitarian assistance. We've provided more than $9 million so far. Samantha Power, the head of USAID, was in Armenia just a few weeks ago and announced that we would be providing $33 million more, Congress willing, to try and address this issue. But here's where the opportunity comes. This is not, I know, a message that will be heard in the way that we intend it, but there is an opportunity. Both Pashinyan and Aliyev have chosen to describe this as a moment when the biggest source of conflict between the two of them, the status of Nagorno-Karabakh, has been settled. And they can start to address the broader issues between these two countries that would result in a dignified and durable peace. Now, we use that formulation for a reason. Dignified and durable for both peoples. We see an opportunity for the two of them in this period as we have not seen before. These two countries are now talking in a serious way. They've both given a little, demanded a lot. In December, there was an agreement between the two countries that resulted in the release of prisoners, detainees that they each had. I think it was something like two Azeris were released and 32 Armenians were released. They also agreed that Armenia would not stand in the way of Azerbaijan's campaign to host COP29, which will happen in November this year. A host of other agreements, including on the terms for delimitation and demarcation of the border. We, the United States, want to support that effort as much as we can without irritating anybody. You know, at the end of the day, they're sovereign nations, right? We can offer our help, but we can't impose it. One of the things that you've also seen as we work with both sides bilaterally and both sides together trilaterally is we're also bringing in other partners. So in April of this year, the United States, the EU, and Armenia got together in Brussels, unprecedented. And that was to provide a package of assistance, and I want to make clear here, not military, but a package of assistance that would build up Armenia's resilience on issues like its economy, trade, tech, climate, food security, energy. And we're going to continue to build on that. Following that conference with the EU in April, you've seen a really impressive drumbeat of visits and engagements between the United States and Armenia, United States and Azerbaijan, and among all of those parties together. So more recently, last month, Jim O'Brien went out to Yerevan to do a strategic dialogue. And this strategic dialogue was significant in that it produced a promotion of the relationship from just a dialogue to a partnership. What does that mean in practice? We're going to be looking at very practical ways to work with each other. And again, I want to emphasize, you know, some people have talked about pivots. I don't find this useful, you know. What we think we're doing is that we are enabling Armenia to have choices, to have a diversity of relationships beyond what had historically been an exclusive relationship with Russia. The truth also is that when you look at that relationship, it's not a surprise that a lot of Armenian people have raised questions, right? First of all, Russia's invading its neighbors. You don't have to look too far. Crimea first, and then an attempt to take all of Ukraine continues today.
Not to mention Georgia.
Russia still occupies 20% of that country. Every neighbor of Russia should be sleeping with one eye open. Armenia is smart to be seeking alternatives. Doesn't mean that they sever relations. You live where you live, you know, and you got to learn to live with your neighbor. That's not going to change. No one's moving. But we very much want to be as supportive as possible of Armenia's effort to diversify its relationships, strengthen its ability to provide security and prosperity for its people, and thirdly, to be in a position where it has the confidence to sign a peace treaty with an ancient enemy. That is hard to do. And you can't sign an agreement of that magnitude from a position of weakness. That will not give you a durable or dignified result. So again, our aim and the aim of each of these parties is to achieve a durable and dignified peace.
Thank you.
That's a long answer to a short question.
Well, and I could ask you a lot more, but just to bring Dan into the conversation as well, I guess a two-part question for you, Dan. One is, are we doing enough in respect to this? And specifically on the security side. But then, pivoting, even though we don't like that word, to the economic side, because the idea of choices, of options, of alternatives for Armenia and other countries in the region is all about the economic and the energy links in the region. So kind of a multi-part question.
Great, thanks, Masha. And before I start, let me say Masha didn't introduce herself, but Masha, of course, was a longtime colleague of both Yuri's and mine at the State Department and served as ambassador to Armenia, which is when I first met her, actually, because I was working in the Human Rights Bureau, and Masha won the Human Rights Award for the ambassador in the world who had contributed most to advancing human rights when she was serving there. Obviously, then went on to serve as ambassador to Ukraine. But in between those, she served as PDAS, as Yuri is now in the European Bureau. And when I went out as ambassador, I remember the meeting that we had where she gave me advice, and that stuck with me. And of course, as Yuri mentioned, she used to run the office at the State Department that sent me my instructions when I was ambassador. So Yuri and I have also worked a lot together. And I know, well, I may not have been as compliant as she might have liked, but we always figured out a way to get along. So, and I know there are several other, I think, former ambassadors in the audience today. So welcome to everybody who's there. And I'm sorry I can't be with you in person. Masha, I want to take the economic piece first, I think, because I think it connects most directly to the kind of arc of opportunity that you said. And picking up where Yuri left off in terms of a durable and dignified peace between Armenia and Azerbaijan, the other piece that unlocks, of course, is the possibility of opening the land border between Turkey and Armenia and creating really the opportunity not only for trade, expanding economic relationship potentially in the medium term between Armenia and Azerbaijan, but trade across the region, including Georgia, and a real connectivity that has been lacking in the South Caucasus for as long as we can remember. And I think when we think about making the case for peace to people in the region, obviously, I said to Masha when we were talking recently that one of the challenges I always found when I was meeting with Armenians and Azerbaijanis in my old job was that I used to say they look at history with a telescope and the future with a microscope. There was always a long discussion about decades or centuries of history, but a very short discussion about what the future looked like. And I think unlocking the possibility for expanded economic connectivity in the region is one of the ways that you give people on the ground a sense that the future can be more prosperous, can be better for them and their families. And I think the economic opportunities that would follow as dividends of peace between Armenia and Azerbaijan and normalization between Armenia and Turkey would benefit not only the inhabitants of those two countries, benefit Turkey, also Georgia, and really create that kind of diversity of economic relationships that allow those countries to weather the ups and downs that come normally with economic cycles in the future and give confidence to the people who live there that they can provide a better future for their families. On the security side, I agree with what Yuri said in terms of there needing to be a sense of kind of confidence in the sovereignty of each of those countries internally. One of the things that, you can talk in geopolitics terms, as Yuri said. Geography doesn't change, so we're not going to move countries around. The geography will remain challenging in many ways, but we can also get quite technical if we leave aside geopolitics. One of the things that could be useful for the United States to kind of ramp up, and probably not on our own, but in conjunction with other partners, and the EU is already doing some work on this, is the way that we can help facilitate border security. If we succeed, if the region succeeds in there is peace and normalization, and borders are more open to trade, that will raise the burden of border controls, et cetera, and being ready for that, being able to handle that kind of transit will be useful, both in facilitating the trade and also giving confidence that those borders are secure and that the durable part of the peace can remain. So that's one area where I would like to see the US with partners continue to invest and ramp up investment and its assistance to Armenia in particular in the coming months.
Thank you, Dan. Yuri, you had mentioned Assistant Secretary O'Brien's trip to the region and the promise, as I understand it, of an enhanced strategic relationship for Armenia. And I was wondering if you could go into the details of what that means, for Armenia, and if you could also talk a little bit about our strategic relationship with Azerbaijan as well, and how that, all works together in a way that obviously works for the United States, because we are first and foremost about the U.S., but we're also about helping to create the conditions for peace and prosperity and democracy in that part of the world.
So on the strategic partnership with Armenia, what we're looking at are a few different areas. So as I mentioned before, they're kind of the same areas that the United States and the EU concentrated on when we met together in April in Brussels. And those will include things like looking at customs issues. Are there barriers that we could reasonably take down? Are there ways to enable greater investment from the United States into Armenia, Armenia in the United States? And in this, one of the biggest assets that we have in the United States is that we've got a really powerful, influential, and active diaspora. And so we want to continue that conversation with our diaspora as well, because this is kind of the moment when I think all of us can make a big difference to strengthen Armenia and the Armenian people in a meaningful way, not just with words of, we love you. And in the United States, obviously we love Armenia, but this is an opportunity for us as the United States to step up with practical measures. So one of the things that you saw was, I think it was just last month too, Deputy Secretary Rich Verma went out to visit Armenia, and he went out there with a delegation led by Nina Hachigian that included local officials from throughout the United States. And what that does is we're trying to build up those connections at all levels and doing our best to spur conversation and action, agreements between those two. We're looking at other elements as well. We're looking at ways that we can use the assistance, the developmental assistance provided by USAID, which is actually quite significant. I think it's something like 77 million in this in this current fiscal year, which is just about double from only 2 years ago. And what we want to do with that is to create some resilience for Armenia on issues like climate and food security. Again, that connects back up with breaking Armenia out of isolation. So that's the Armenia piece. On Azerbaijan, if we look at a map, it's fairly clear. If you look at the infrastructure and the natural resources that are there, that Azerbaijan has a very important role to play. And the leader of Azerbaijan also has an historic choice to make. Just alone, one of the major conduits for energy and energy diversification in Europe is the Southern Gas Corridor, right, which is made up of 3 different pipelines. There's the Southern Caucasus pipeline, the Trans-Anatolian pipeline, which then connects up with the Trans-Adriatic pipeline. And that enables Azerbaijan to provide gas to Greece, Italy, Serbia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria. I know I'm forgetting a few others because there's something like 8 countries that get gas off of this corridor. the Europeans, as part of their now very successful effort to break free of energy dependence on Russia, was looking to build a relationship with Azerbaijan that would allow a doubling of gas being piped from Azerbaijan into Europe. So they were aiming for 20 BCM by the year 2027. I just saw that Aliyev thought that that might not be possible because the Europeans were not investing enough. I don't know what the situation is, but that's the goal, and we're pointed in the right direction. So we're trying to develop that relationship. We want a full relationship with Azerbaijan. What that also means is we're pretty straightforward about areas where we think the Azeris could do better. Areas where Aliyev has responsibility and opportunity to do better. He's created a context for himself that exceeds what his father was able to accomplish. And our hope is that Aliyev sees for himself the same historic opportunity to leave his mark that people like me see, right? I think people can see it. But he's got to make some choices. We think that he's moving, in some cases, in the right direction. So, for example, one of the human rights cases that we've really been focused on was this issue of this scholar named Kubat Ibadoglu. We've been bugging him for quite some time. And just a couple of months ago, the Azeris took him out of full arrest and put him into house arrest. Right direction. Job's not done.
Yeah, job's not done. A former colleague of all of ours told me that when she looks at the situation in Azerbaijan, almost every single person that she worked with when she was in Baku is in jail or under house arrest. So clearly, and looking at you, Dan, as somebody who dealt with a lot of these issues, is that balance right with regard to Azerbaijan in terms of our security interests and our interests in terms of our values and the values that, as you said, Yuri, are so important for Azerbaijan as well to move forward in the world and in a relationship with us.
Yeah, and President Aliyev has a golden opportunity now, right? With the world coming to Baku in November this year for COP29. And he's got to decide, what is the Azerbaijan, the modern Azerbaijan under his tenure? What does he want to present to the world? I think he's got a big opportunity here, and we hope that he takes it.
Yeah, I certainly second that. Dan, do you have thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, I think, as Yuri will know, I'm not the most popular person in Baku. The Azerbaijani government has come after me repeatedly for raising human rights cases and human rights conditions more generally, and the cozying up that we've seen between President Aliyev and President Putin in the recent years is driven both by geopolitical events and also by a common approach to governance, which is authoritarian and deeply repressive. In comparison to the other two countries in the region right now, the people of Georgia, it's very sad what's happening with the government turning away from progress towards democracy, progress towards deeper ties that can offer promise to the Georgian people in their future. But the people of Georgia remain committed to the idea of a free, democratic, prosperous Georgia. And the people of Armenia are deeply committed to a free, democratic, prosperous Armenia. The drop in support, or the drop in the perception of Russia as a good friend of Armenia in the last few years has been unthinkable. If you had told me 5 years ago that Armenia was going to be the bright light of democracy in the Caucasus and Georgia was going to be backsliding, I would have thought, how could that possibly be true? So Armenia and Georgia, well, on different courses right now, what they have in common is they have a people who are committed to a democratic future. I suspect that that's also true in Azerbaijan if the people in Azerbaijan could actually speak up. And one of the things about the closer relationship that we've seen between President Aliyev and President Putin in recent years is that that may be good for President Aliyev's short-term calculations of preserving his own regime, but it's certainly not good in the long run for the Azerbaijani people. Again, that doesn't mean that any of these countries are going to stop having relationships with Russia. Geography will determine that they will always have a relationship with Russia, but to be dependent on Russia is an incredibly dangerous position to be in. And I think people should keep in mind that when we advocate for the release of political prisoners in Azerbaijan, or when we make the case that President Aliyev should do more to uphold the rule of law, to allow free debate and criticism, that's not because the United States government takes on a role as a human rights advocacy organization, and that's how we think of ourselves. It's because we believe, and history has borne out, that when free democratic societies are allowed to flourish, it benefits people on the ground. And that's why we make that case. It benefits them not only economically, but it benefits their security in the long run. And we can always be doing more to advocate for those values. They should be at the center of our foreign policy.
Thank you. Thanks, Dan. I would completely agree with that comment as well. But I think, the reality is it's always hard to balance, all of the various interests that the U.S. or any other country has. And so getting that right is more an art than a science. And obviously not everybody agrees with how where we come out. And there are probably people in this audience that don't necessarily agree with where U.S. policy is today, but maybe that will come out in the Q&A. So you had mentioned Georgia, Dan, and so I do want to get to Georgia. Huge and important elections coming up this fall, and it appears to me, as somebody who is not a Georgia expert and has not been closely following, but it appears to me that the people, as you intimated, Yuri, that the people are in one place when it comes to what direction they want the country to go in. And it's the same direction that they've wanted for the last 20 years. We know that these things take time, and yet the government is going a different way. I don't know if you want to comment on the new Russia law that was recently passed in Georgia regarding NGOs and media.
I sure do.
And how we are approaching that, because again, these are sovereign decisions for countries to make. They have their own choices.
Right. And countries that are democracies, as Georgia is, are obligated to listen to their people. And their people have been consistent and overwhelming in saying that they want to be with Europe, and not just in terms of integrating their economy into Europe, but institutionally, culturally, values-wise, the way they govern. And so I think the law that the Georgians just passed on foreign agents is exactly the wrong thing to do. We're talking about a law that essentially mimics what the Kremlin put out. Mm-hmm. People call it the Russian law. Mm-hmm. Not only that, it's such a bad law, and a law that people recognize, the Georgian people recognize, is not in their interest, that hundreds of thousands of people came out to protest, unprecedented, right? And for those of us who have followed Georgia, there are hearts breaking throughout Washington, D.C. Yeah. Because Georgia used to be kind of like the golden child of the region. And now we have a situation in which our affinity and our connection with the Georgian people remains as close as ever. But the relationship with the Georgian dream is not what we would wish it to be. as hard as we have tried. And part of it is that they've gone intentionally and said things that are simply not true.
Yeah.
Fake news, right? I'll give you an example, and people will call me a bad diplomat for saying this, but I'm going to say it anyway. When you claim that the United States, wants to open up a second front in the war in Georgia, that is fake news. That couldn't be farther from the truth. When you claim that the American ambassador, the representative, the personal representative of the American president, is somehow running a rogue operation to perform implement a coup against the elected government of a friendly country like Georgia, again, fake news. Couldn't be further from the truth. When you claim that there is a global war party that wants to harm Georgia, fake news. When you claim that Washington officials currently say things about, they object to what Georgian Dream is doing, but the real relationship with the United States is as healthy as ever, fake news. Can't have it both ways. You can't claim that you represent your people and you want a future in Europe and a strong relationship with the United States, and then do things that your people and your friends have pointed out to you are exactly what Russia does and what Russia wants. This is nuts, especially when 20% of the country is occupied by Russia. So it really baffles the mind why leaders would choose to do the bidding of those who occupy 20% of their sovereign territory and ignore the well-intentioned advice of friends who have been with them for more than 32 years.
And
if anyone's got a good answer, let me know.
Yeah, and their own people.
Yeah.
Well, I would say that the autocracy club is alive and well, and the tool of using corruption as a method of state capture through leadership is alive and well, and the Kremlin is one of the best at this game. Dan, I don't know if you want to add anything.
I just want to, often when we talk about democracy, it gets into kind of a high-level conversation. But one of the sad parts of this is that Georgia had made enormous progress in delivering dividends from democratic change to its people in the last decade. And obviously, when you start to crack down on civic space, when you start to go after NGOs, when you close media space, et cetera, you can expect that the corruption that you have rooted out will come back, is back. And Georgia was an example for a lot of countries. I visited Tbilisi in, 2014, maybe 2015, and saw the way that they had centralized a kind of citizen services center where you could go get a new passport, you could get a driver's license, you could file your taxes, you could start a business, et cetera, in a very customer-friendly way, transparent, digitized, et cetera. And those kinds of changes make real change in people's lives. They're not possible when you're running a shadow economy that is driven by corruption, et cetera. And the loss of that kind of progress is not just a loss for democracy, though it is surely that. It's a loss for the way that everyday people go about making their lives and building a better future for their families. So there's a human cost that is happening now because of the wrong turn that Georgia's government has taken.
Yeah, so corruption, the tax on the poor, as we often say. Yeah, it's really a terrible thing. So in response to what we're seeing happening in Georgia now, and again, it's a sovereign country, gets to move in the direction it decides it's going to go, what is U.S. policy? It seems like it's more sticks than carrots at this point.
Look, I think the costs and benefits of moving away from Georgia's European trajectory are quite apparent. It's apparent to the people, it's apparent to the government, which is also why you have this very convoluted effort to say that that Georgia is going to stay on its European trajectory, even as it undoes and contradicts everything that is part of moving in that direction. So, the foreign agent law is just the tip of the iceberg, but there are other actions as well. This hasn't escaped the attention of leaders in Brussels. Mm-hmm. And, High Representative Borrell was quite clear that if the Georgian government continues on this track, they're going to end up with the door to the European Union shut in their faces. And I don't think that that's what any of us want. Mm-hmm. Certainly not those of us, the United States, that has invested so much. And I'm not talking about developmental assistance, but emotionally, politically. Yeah. The United States has invested so much in the success of Georgia's democracy and the desire to be there for that country to be as secure and as democratic and as prosperous as possible. And they were going the right way. Yeah. And they've been knocked off that trajectory. There is an opportunity to course correct, and it's time to do some reflecting on the part of leaders in Tbilisi.
So I'm going to move to questions from the audience, and there's one that is a follow-on to what you just said, Yuri. So this is the question: with the Georgian government pivoting towards closer relations with Russia, what strategies should and could the U.S. adopt to support pro-democracy movements within the country and align its government more closely with Western values? I can already hear the Kremlin saying colored revolutions.
Yeah, look, we're going to continue to be honest with leaders in Tbilisi. As you noted earlier, Jim O'Brien has been out to Tbilisi. We've got a brand new ambassador who's terrific, who builds on the work of the previous ambassador, who was also terrific. And we're going to continue to engage. What we're not going to do is to pretend that we don't hear the contradictions and that we don't see the damage that the Georgian government is choosing to do to its future and its reputation and to the relationship with the United States. We're very troubled by it. Mm-hmm. Like I said, hearts are breaking all over Washington, D.C.
Yeah, it's been a long and deep relationship. Yeah. So there's another question about Georgia here with regard to the Georgian government's multi-vectored foreign policy approach that, according to the Georgian Dream Party, entails pragmatic relations with Russia, China, and others. Does the U.S. support that, or does the U.S. believe that such an approach is incompatible with continued strategic partnership with Tbilisi? And then a specific question that China is building a deep seaport in Anaklia and another major airport in Tbilisi by a Chinese company sanctioned by the U.S.
So countries make their own decisions, governments make their own decisions, but here are some facts to consider. Russia has invaded several of its neighbors for no good reason besides a twisted revision of history and a belief that the Kremlin should have command over its near abroad. Consider that. Consider the fact that 20% of Georgia remains occupied by Russia. I'm not sure it's real smart to try to be friends with the country that is occupying your sovereign territory. Consider the fact that there are plenty of reports out there about the way in which the People's Republic of China uses technology and uses loans, debt traps, uses its involvement in infrastructure projects to create dependencies that ultimately do not benefit the local people and in fact harm them. Ask the people of Montenegro what it was like to get into a debt trap. Ask Sri Lanka. The list goes on and on. You know, ask the neighbors in the region what it's like to have a close relationship with China. In comparison, I think the Georgian government should think about all that we have been able to do together between Georgia and the United States, and think about the fact that they have chosen to seek a future in the European family, in the EU. There are requirements. It's not you just go up and they let you in. There are actually standards for what it means to be a member of the EU. There are standards for what it means to be a member of NATO. And they apply to every country equally. So they've got to match up, they've got to close that gap. The say-do gap is pretty glaring right now. And it really is the responsibility of Georgian Dream and its leaders to close the gap between what it says it wants and what it's doing.
And what the Georgian people
want.
Georgian people want. Yeah, that is crucially important. So moving back to moving south to Armenia and NK and Azerbaijan, is active support for the Armenian population to return to NK on the U.S. foreign policy agenda? And then there's a follow-up question. Azerbaijan appears to have committed a number of human rights violations against the residents of Nagorno-Karabakh. How can the international community hold Azerbaijan accountable?
So we've got lots of credible experts that we are working with to collect as much data as possible on what happened before, during, and after September 19, September 20 last year, because there's also a history behind it. 100,000 plus people departed Nagorno-Karabakh. Most of them went into Armenia. So the first order of business is to provide as much material support to those who fled as possible. And as I mentioned, USAID is flowing a lot of money in that direction. It's part of the reason why I went with Samantha Power out to Armenia and out to the Lachin corridor as soon as possible, because we wanted to be able to come back to Washington and say, we've seen this with our own eyes and we need to act quickly. So we're doing that. The third thing is to enable a situation in which those who want to return are able to do so safely and with dignity. And we're not there yet on that, but that's an obligation that Azerbaijan has, right? They've got to stick with international commitments and standards on that score. And then thirdly, in the interim, we get reports of cultural artifacts and buildings being destroyed in Nagorno-Karabakh. Most of it is focused on Armenian artifacts. Some of it is focused on Azeri elements as well. Our view on this is that both sides have an obligation to protect these sites. More than that, we're also working with international organizations like UNESCO and others to ensure that there's some degree of protection. But this is a difficult issue.
Protection for people?
For the sites.
Oh, I see. Excuse
me. There are hardly any people, Armenians, left in Nagorno-Karabakh. Yeah.
But earlier you'd been talking about those who want to go back.
Those who want to go back should be able to go back. Yeah.
Yeah, that's clearly a ways off in the future.
Yeah.
But I'm glad to hear that is on
that's definitely on the
U.S.
scope.
agenda. So one more question about, the very complicated relationship between Azerbaijan and Armenia, which is how likely are peace-building efforts to succeed with authoritarian regimes, such as Azerbaijan? Now, we all know we don't get to pick who we negotiate with. We need to negotiate with the ones that we're in conflict with, but it's a good question. I mean, can one actually deal with authoritarian regimes? Is there any reliability to what they say?
We have the world that we have, and we all can have feelings and judgments about countries and persons. My job as an American diplomat is to keep in mind what the U.S. interest is and to figure out a workable solution. If we all had the choice just to sit with those countries that we like and those people that we admire, I would be out of a job. So, but our job as diplomats really is to try to find that path through a difficult thicket.
Yeah, I just add, based on my experience, that usually there is an element of self-interest in all of these kinds of negotiations, and finding what it is that each side needs so that everybody gets something. And that can be difficult for the other side. Sometimes those are concessions, sometimes they aren't. Sometimes it's something a third party is willing or able to provide, but finding out what each party wants, and then in some cases needs, and trying to bring all that together. I would say that, I have often remarked that diplomacy and diplomats, and I apologize, I think I've been turning my back to everybody in this side of the room, that diplomats and diplomacy, we are the most optimistic of people, because
you have to be.
Even when there is when there are dark days, and I'm not saying that applies to this particular situation, you have to keep on having hope, you have to keep on working away at it, and sort of laying the groundwork for when there will be hope. And right now, in the Caucasus, it seems like there is a lot of food for thought, a lot of ability to hope that we can really move forward in an important way that not only creates the stability that I think all of the countries need, including the powerful ones, but also lays the groundwork for those for prosperity, the interconnections that will make that possible for all of the countries. Yeah. So I will get off my soapbox and just ask Yuri and Dan if they have any concluding statements or thoughts that they want to share with everybody.
Just thank you for the opportunity. I think this is a really important time, and we've got a sweet spot of opportunity in the South Caucasus. Where there's a real big overlap between what we can do and what we really need to do. So we've got to act.
Yeah, yeah. Dan?
Yeah,
you
just
got the last word.
Picking up on the last question about whether it's possible to make a deal with Aliyev or with other authoritarian leaders. I think I agree with you, Masha, that there's any deal like that is always going to be durable because it's in the interest of, or the perceived interest of all the parties. And I think there's no question that the facts on the ground support the fact that peace is in the interest of all the people on the ground. Peace is in everyone's interest. And yes, the thorny details of how you work out that agreement are difficult, but getting there is clearly in the interest of everyone on the ground. It's also in the interest of Turkey. And we haven't talked a lot about Turkey today, but I think one of the things that would give me confidence in a Armenia-Azerbaijan peace deal would be that it likely would not happen without Turkey's support quietly or overtly behind the scenes. And Turkey would, in some sense, have to play a role of a guarantor, informally at least. And, this is a real opportunity for Turkish leadership, too, in providing that quiet support, that encouragement to both sides, and obviously particularly to Azerbaijan, to to take the hard steps of making peace. And I think if Armenia and Azerbaijan are able to make peace, I think it unlocks a new sense of possibility for the region. And just to wrap up, I think it's really important that we stay focused on the affirmative possibility that is in front of these countries. I am concerned about the increased dependency on Russia in several of these countries, particularly in the wake of the war in Ukraine, where economic ties between these countries and Russia have actually increased. I'm concerned about that. I don't think it's good for their long-term future, but I think we should stay focused on what Yuri started with, which is the diversification of the positive relationships that can help people have a belief in the future. And I care less about which other friends they have, and more about Europe, the United States, other democratic partners stepping up to make sure that there are choices for these people who are living in this region and who have been ignored in many ways or left out of the headlines for so long, because their futures matter.
Well, that is a great place to stop. Thank you for those inspiring words. And thank you, Yuri, for the positive vision that the U.S. government has for the future and the important work that you're doing to make it so. So I want to thank everybody for coming today. There's going to be, I think, a coffee afterwards. Is that right? Somebody? A reception? It's out there? Okay. All right. So thank you very much, everybody, for coming, and I hope to have a chance to chat with some of you afterwards. Okay.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, you're still hot.